Anywhere you go, give it on. Anywhere you say, anywhere.
Times Square is a major commercial intersection, tourist destination, entertainment hub, and neighborhood in the Midtown Manhattan section of New York City. It is formed by the junction of Broadway, 7th Avenue, and 42nd Street. Together with adjacent Duffy Square, Times Square is a bow-tie-shaped plaza 5 blocks long between 42nd and 47th Streets. Times Square is brightly lit by numerous digital billboards and advertisements as well as businesses offering 24/7 service. One of the world's busiest pedestrian areas, it is also the hub of the Broadway Theater District and a major center of the world's entertainment industry. Times Square is one of the world's most visited tourist attractions, drawing an estimated 50 million visitors annually. Approximately 330,000 people pass through Times Square daily, many of them tourists, while over 460,000 pedestrians walk through Times Square on its busiest days. The Times Square 42nd Street and 42nd Street Port Authority bus terminal stations have consistently ranked as the busiest in the New York City subway system, transporting more than 200,000 passengers daily. Formerly known as Longacre Square, Times Square was renamed in 1904 after the New York Times moved its headquarters to the then newly erected Times Building, now One Times Square. It is the site of the annual New Year's Eve ball drop, which began on December 31, 1907, and continues to attract over 1 million visitors to Times Square every year, in addition to a worldwide audience of 1 billion or more on various digital media platforms. Times Square, specifically the intersection of Broadway and 42nd Street, is the eastern terminus of the Lincoln Highway, the first road across the United States for motorized vehicles. Times Square is sometimes referred to as the crossroads of the world and the heart of the Great White Way. Geography. Times Square functions as a town square, but is not geometrically a square. It is closer in shape to a bow-tie, with two triangles emanating roughly north and south from 45th Street, where 7th Avenue intersects Broadway. Broadway similarly intersects other north-south avenues at Union Square, Madison Square, Herald Square, and Verdi Square, none of which are squares. The area is bounded by West 42nd Street, West 47th Street, 7th Avenue, and Broadway. Broadway runs diagonally, crossing through the horizontal and vertical street grid of Manhattan laid down by the Commissioner's Plan of 1811, and that intersection creates the bow-tie shape of Times Square. Times Square is the official name of the Southern Triangle, below 45th Street. The Northern Triangle is officially known as Duffy Square and was dedicated in June 1939 to honor World War I chaplain Father Francis P. Duffy of the 69th New York Infantry Regiment. A statue by Charles Keck was dedicated in May 1937 as a memorial to Duffy. There is also a statue of composer and entertainer George M. Cohan, and the TKTS discount ticket booth for same-day Broadway and off-Broadway theaters that has been at the site since June 1973. History. Early history. When Manhattan Island was first settled by the Dutch colonists, 3 small streams united near what is now the intersection of 10th Avenue and 40th Street. These 3 streams formed the Great Kill. From there the Great Kill wound through the low-lying Reed Valley, known for fish and waterfowl, and emptied into a deep bay in the Hudson River at the present 42nd Street. The name was retained in a tiny hamlet, Great Kill, that became a center for carriage making, as the upland to the south and east became known as Longacre. Before and after the American Revolution, the area belonged to John Warren Scott, a general of the New York militia, in which he served under George Washington. Scott's manor house was at what is currently 43rd Street, surrounded by countryside used for farming and breeding horses. In the first half of the 19th century, it became one of the prized possessions of John Jacob Astor, who made a second fortune selling off lots to hotels and other real estate concerns as the city rapidly spread uptown. By 1872, the area had become the center of New York's horse carriage industry. The locality had not previously been given a name, and city authorities called it Longacre Square after Longacre in London, where the horse and carriage trade was centered in that city. William Henry Vanderbilt owned and ran the American Horse Exchange there. In 1910, it became the Winter Garden Theater. As more profitable commerce and industrialization of Lower Manhattan pushed homes, theaters, and prostitution northward from the Tenderloin district, Longacre Square became nicknamed the Thieves' Lair for its rollicking reputation as a low entertainment district. The first theater on the square, the Olympia, was built by cigar manufacturer and impresario Oscar Hammerstein I according to Gotham. A History of New York City to 1898. By the early 1890s, this once sparsely settled stretch of Broadway was ablaze with electric light and thronged by crowds of middle and upper-class theater, restaurant and cafe patrons. 1900s to 1930s. In 1904, New York Times publisher Adolph S. Ochs moved the newspaper's operations to a new skyscraper on 42nd Street at Longacre Square, on the site of the former Pabst Hotel, which had existed on the site for less than a decade since it opened in November 1899. Ochs persuaded Mayor George B. McClellan Jr. to construct a subway station there, and the area was renamed Times Square on April 8, 1904. Just 3 weeks later, the first electrified advertisement appeared on the side of a bank at the corner of 46th Street and Broadway. The north end later became Duffy Square, and the former Horse Exchange became the Winter Garden Theater, constructed in 1911. The New York Times moved to more spacious offices 1 block west of the square in 1913 and sold the building in 1961. The old Times building was later named the Allied Chemical Building in 1963. Now known simply as 1 Times Square, it is famed for the Times Square ball drop on its roof every New Year's Eve. In 1913, the Lincoln Highway Association, headed by entrepreneur Carl G. Fisher, chose the intersection of 42nd Street and Broadway to be the eastern terminus of the Lincoln Highway. This was the first road across the United States, which originally ran 3,389 miles coast to coast through 13 states to its western terminus in Lincoln Park in San Francisco. Times Square grew dramatically after World War I. It became a cultural hub full of theaters, music halls, and upscale hotels. Times Square quickly became New York's agora, a place to gather to await great tidings and to celebrate them, whether a World Series or a presidential election. James Traub, The Devil's Playground. A century of pleasure and profit in Times Square. Advertising also grew significantly in the 1920s, growing from $25 million to $85 million over the decade. For example, the Wrigley Spearmint Gum sign, possibly the biggest electric sign in the world, cost $9,000 per month to rent. Some contemporary critics, such as Thorstein Veblen and G.K. Chesterton, disliked the advertising at Times Square. Fritz Lang, after seeing Times Square in 1923, used it as inspiration for his dark industrial film Metropolis. Entertainment icons such as Irving Berlin, Charlie Chaplin, and Fred Astaire were closely associated with Times Square in the 1910s, 1920s, and 1930s. However, it was also during this period that the area began to be besieged by crime and corruption, in the form of gambling and prostitution. One case that garnered huge attention was the arrest and subsequent execution of police officer Charles Becker. 1930s to 1950s. The general atmosphere of Times Square changed with the onset of the Great Depression in the early 1930s. City residents moved uptown to cheaper neighborhoods, and many popular theaters closed, replaced by saloons, brothels, burlesque halls, vaudeville stages, and dime houses. The area acquired a reputation as a dangerous and seedy neighborhood in the following decades. Nevertheless, Times Square continued to be the site of the annual ball drop on New Year's Eve. The ball drop was placed on hiatus for New Year's Eve in 1942 and 1943 due to lighting restrictions during World War II, replaced by a moment of silence that was observed at midnight in Times Square, accompanied by the sound of chimes played from sound trucks. On May 8, 1945, a massive crowd celebrated Victory in Europe Day in Times Square, and on August 15, 1945, the largest crowd in the history of Times Square gathered to celebrate victory over Japan Day, reaching an estimated 2 million. The victory itself was announced by a headline on the Zipper news ticker at 1 Times Square, which read, "Official Truman announces Japanese surrender." 1960s to 1990s. Decline. From the 1960s to the early 1990s, the seediness of the area, especially due to its go-go bars, sex shops, peep shows, and adult theaters, became an infamous symbol of the city's decline. As early as 1960, 42nd Street between 7th and 8th Avenues was described by the New York Times as the worst block in town. Later that decade, Times Square was depicted in Midnight Cowboy as gritty, depraved, and desperate. Conditions only worsened in the 1970s and 1980s, as did the crime in the rest of the city, with a 1981 article in Rolling Stone magazine calling 42nd Street in Times Square the sleaziest block in America. In the mid-1980s, the area bounded by 40th and 50th Streets and 7th and 9th Avenues saw over 15,000 crime complaints per year. The block of 42nd Street between 7th and 8th Avenues had 2,300 crimes per year in 1984, of which 20% were felonies. Times Square was known in the 1970s to 80s as the most notorious area for prostitution. In this era, formerly elegant movie theaters began to show X-rated films, and peep shows hustlers were common. In 1984, the area was so derelict and dilapidated that the entire Times Square area paid the city only $6 million in property taxes. 1980s building boom. In the 1980s, a commercial building boom began in the western parts of Midtown as part of a long-term development plan developed under mayors Ed Koch and David Dinkins. These included office buildings such as 1540 Broadway, 1585 Broadway, and 757th Avenue, as well as hotels such as the Macklowe Hotel, Marriott Marquis, Crowne Plaza, and Doubletree Suites. By 1986, New York City Planning Commission was considering enacting regulations that would have forced new buildings along Times Square to include bright signage as well as deep setbacks. The CPC adopted a planning regulation in 1987, which required large new developments in Times Square to set aside about 5% of their space for entertainment uses. The regulation also required new buildings on Times Square to include large, bright signs. The buildings at 1540 Broadway, 1585 Broadway, and 757th Avenue were completed at the beginning of the early 1990s recession, when 14.5% of Manhattan office space was vacant. Furthermore, some 9 times 10 square feet of office space in the western section of Midtown had been developed in the 1980s, of which only half had been leased. Consequently, 1540 Broadway was completely empty, while 1585 Broadway and 757th Avenue had one tenant each, despite the buildings having over 2 times 10 square feet of office space between them. Entertainment conglomerate Bertelsmann bought 1540 Broadway in 1992, spurring a revival of Times Square in the early 1990s. This was hastened when financial firm Morgan Stanley bought 1585 Broadway in 1993, followed by 757th Avenue in 1994. 42nd Street redevelopment, further revitalization. The Empire State Development Corporation, an agency of the New York State government, had proposed redeveloping the area around a portion of West 42nd Street in 1981. 4 towers designed by Philip Johnson and John Berge were to be built around 42nd Street's intersections with Broadway and 7th Avenue. These towers would have been redeveloped by George Klein of Park Tower Realty, though the Prudential Insurance Company of America joined the project in 1986. Furthermore, as part of the West Midtown Special Zoning District created in 1982, the New York City government had allowed new buildings in Times Square to be developed with an increased floor area ratio. To ensure the area would not be darkened at nightfall, the city passed zoning regulations that encouraged developers to add large, bright signs on their buildings. In 1990, the state of New York took possession of 6 of the 9 historic theaters on 42nd Street, and the new 42nd Street nonprofit organization was appointed to oversee their restoration and maintenance. The theaters underwent renovation for Broadway shows, conversion for commercial purposes, or demolition. Opposition to the towers on Times Square, along with Prudential and Park Tower's inability to secure tenants for the proposed buildings, led government officials to allow Prudential and Park Tower to postpone the project in 1992. By then, Prudential had spent $300 million on condemning the sites through eminent domain. The partners retained the right to develop the sites in the future, and the ESDC's zoning guidelines remained in effect. In exchange for being permitted to delay construction of the sites until 2002, Prudential and Park Tower were compelled to add stores and install large signage on the existing buildings. In 1992, the Times Square Alliance, a coalition of city government and local businesses dedicated to improving the quality of commerce and cleanliness in the district, started operations in the area. In 1998, the Alliance opened a tourist information center in the former Embassy Theater at 1560 Broadway. The information center operated until 2014. In the mid-1990s, Mayor Rudolph Giuliani led an effort to clean up the area, an effort that is described by Steve Masick in Urban Nightmares. The media, the right, and the moral panic over the city. Security was increased, pornographic theaters were closed, and undesirable, low-rent residents were pressured to relocate, and then more tourist-friendly attractions and upscale establishments were opened. Advocates of the remodeling claim that the neighborhood is safer and cleaner. Detractors have countered that the changes have homogenized or Disneyfied the character of Times Square and have unfairly targeted lower-income New Yorkers from nearby neighborhoods such as Hell's Kitchen. The changes were shaped in large part by the actions of the Walt Disney Company, which bought and restored the New Amsterdam Theater after several attempts at redevelopment had failed. As part of a contract with Disney, officials from the city and state evicted the pornographic theaters and contracted with Madame Tussauds and AMC Theaters to move onto 42nd Street. This spurred the construction of new office towers, hotels, and tourist attractions in the area. Prudential and Klein dissolved their partnership for the 4 office building sites at Times Square's southern end in 1996. The same year, Douglas Durst acquired the site at the northeast corner of Broadway and 42nd Street, and he developed 4 Times Square there. The northwest corner of 7th Avenue and 42nd Street was taken by Reuters, which enlisted Rudin Management as its development partner and built 3 Times Square on that corner. That building opened in 2001. In 1998, a joint venture of Klein, the Blackstone Group, and Boston Properties won the right to acquire the sites at the southwest and southeast corners of 42nd Street and 7th Avenue for $330 million. 5 Times Square was completed on the southwest corner site in 2002, and Times Square Tower opened on the southeast corner site in 2004. Effects. Times Square now boasts attractions such as ABC's Times Square Studios, where Good Morning America is broadcast live, competing Hershey's and M&M's stores across the street from each other, and multiple multiplex movie theaters. Additionally, the area contains restaurants such as the Bubba Gump Shrimp Company, a seafood establishment, Planet Hollywood Restaurant and Bar, a theme restaurant, and Carmine's, serving Italian cuisine. It has also attracted several large financial, publishing, and media firms to set up headquarters in the area. A larger presence of police has improved the safety of the area. The theaters of Broadway and the huge number of animated neon and LED signs have been one of New York's iconic images as well as a symbol of the intensely urban aspects of Manhattan. Since 1987, such signage has been mandated by zoning ordinances that require building owners to display illuminated signs, the only district in New York City with this requirement. The neighborhood has a minimum limit for lighting instead of the standard maximum limit. The density of illuminated signs in Times Square rivals that in Las Vegas. Officially, signs in Times Square are called spectaculars, and the largest of them are called jumbotrons. This signage ordinance was implemented in accordance with guidelines set in a revitalization program that New York Governor Mario Cuomo implemented in 1993. Notable signage includes the Toshiba billboard directly under the Nye Ball Drop, the curved 7-story NASDAQ sign at the NASDAQ market site at 4 Times Square on 43rd Street, and the curved Coca-Cola sign located underneath another large LED display owned and operated by Samsung. Both the Coca-Cola sign and Samsung LED displays were built by LED display manufacturer Daktronics. Times Square's first environmentally friendly billboard powered by wind and solar energy was first lit on December 4, 2008. The new 20 Times Square development hosts the largest LED signage in Times Square at 18,000 square feet. The display is 1,000 square feet larger than the Times Square Walgreens display and one of the largest video-capable screens in the world.